and
Hello.
welcome to America's Widows, a show where we talk about Winter as the Soldier Falcon. I'm, I, wow, that one really got you, huh?
Sorry.
Not at all. I'm Mark Loafers Laherty. This is Kimberly Chu.
Hello.
Hello.
Be easily amused.
Yes. And heads up, we've been discussing racism all along, but this time we plan to really get into it, so be aware, because we want to talk about Madripoor.
Do we? Do we want to talk about Madripoor?
Perhaps want is a strong word, but here we are. So, Madripoor is a city-state in Southeast Asia that apparently, based on illustrations in the comics, is in the general region of Singapore, and it is coded as a lawless, suspicious area. So,
Indeed.
Kim, do you want to talk about that?
Want is a very strong word for the way I feel about Madripoor. Okay, so Madripoor appears in this episode, sort of midway through the episode, as a location to which Bucky, Sam, and Zemo head, which we're definitely going to get into later. It's also a location from the comics, especially in the X-Men comics, which is very much designed after Singapore. In this episode, we get more of a Tokyo noir kind of aesthetic, which I take exception to for other reasons. I just find it hilarious that Madripoor and other depictions of Singapore portray sort of this area as like a lawless, pirate-filled, vice-ridden crime city full of economic inequality and no police. Given that, I mean, I'm also thinking of like how the Pirates of the Caribbean has Singapore as basically this exact same thing, except old-timey and without neon lights. This is apparently the way that people think we are, and I find that extremely funny, considering that Singapore is just basically a nation of cops.
Yeah. I can tell how funny you find it from how much you're laughing and how cheery you seem about it.
I mean, it is funny to me. It's like offensive, but it's just kind of funny offensive. It's not like
I get it.
I'm gonna take a minute to talk about how Orientalist and disgusting all the stereotypes are, but I just think it's really funny that this is the stereotype they went for Singapore, because there's a lot of horrifying Orientalist stereotypes you could use for my country, but lawless piracy city is really not one of them.
Oh, it's not even the correct kind of racism.
We don't even have street vendors.
They just sort of plucked something out of thin air.
Busking. The government outlawed unlicensed busking on the street, and you think we're all pirates?
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Okay, so the thing about Madripoor is that, aside from the fact that it's hilariously inaccurate, I think it continues the long tradition of Western media portraying Asian places as locations without culture, or locations without people.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's notable that despite the fact that Madripoor is a location in Southeast Asia, we see no Asians in this whole episode.
Oh god, you're right.
Did you notice that all the gangsters are either white or black? Like, there are no Asian people, which I find very strange.
Oh no.
There's you've got this sort of Blade Runner, Tokyo, vaguely Japanesey aesthetic going on with all the like...
And I do like that aesthetic, but it's so random here.
The sort of cyberpunk manga darkness and water on the streets and like neon lights. Which, first of all, didn't they say Madripoor was in Southeast Asia? And it's got like a vaguely Indonesian sounding name. So I don't know how they got Japan. So, you know...
oh, I think you know how they got Japan.
I mean, I know how they got Japan. It's a thing my friend Edward Said likes to call Orientalism. But
how is he, by the way? I haven't
Edward
seen him
Said?
in a few months. Yeah.
He's dead.
Oh, that's a shame. We should go for drinks. Anyway, you were saying.
My good friend Edward Said has a thing called Orientalism, where he says it's basically this idea that everything in the so-called Orient is the same country, which is how you end up with a Southeast Asian country called Madripoor, where all the signs are in Japanese.
Yes.
Which, okay, sure, I mean, fine. And yet not a single Japanese person.
Yeah, not even, they couldn't even.
Yeah, and not to, like, get too far from the show, but there is so I'm a librarian, and I spend a lot of time in libraries sort of browsing the sections. Part of my job is doing a thing called reading, where I go through all the collections in my library and I pull out books that are old or damaged or otherwise need to be removed so we can make space for new books, which means that I spend a lot of time reading blurbs, and I am shocked, I say to you, how many adult fiction books in English are set in Asia and have no Asian people in them. You don't actually get this with most other areas of the world. Like, there's representation problems for basically everything that is not Europe and white America. But you seldom see nowadays books about Africa that don't have African people in them. I mean, like, obviously you do, but significantly less so. But the number of books about Vietnam and China and Japan and Indonesia and India that are all white casts or about, like, white people during the war is quite astonishing. And I really want to know what it is about Asia that makes it such an appealing location to totally sweep every human being out of and plant unrelated plots in.
By the way, is, I think, more than 50% of the people in the world.
Yes.
It's the blip. It's themes.
That's true. Every Asian got blipped.
Yeah.
Replaced by white people.
Oh dear.
That does explain how fictional Singapore ended up like a crime city. We just all disappeared, including our government. And replaced by
Thanos
white
was
pirates.
lying. It wasn't random. He did get racist with it.
Yeah, you see?
We cracked the code.
Yeah. And I think also that if we are thinking about this use of Asia, we might want to consider, for instance, how Asian settings don't... Like, again, first of all, how there are, like, still no Asian main characters in the MCU. Am I right about this?
Well, we have Shang-Chi and the whatever the fuck in the pipeline.
Alright, they're not in yet, though.
They're not in yet.
I don't think Doctor Strange's friend Wong counts. I'm sorry.
That's completely valid.
We could count him. I don't know. We give you one.
Wait. Daredevil had a whole fucking yellow fever panic thing in season 2.
I did not watch Daredevil. I don't think I will.
I didn't watch Daredevil either. I just heard about this.
Okay. Fine.
What about Iron Man 1? Was that a thing?
Oh no, the Mandarin's not even Asian, so you're thinking about Iron Man 3.
They
the
like
Mandarin's a white guy.
Matrix dodges to that.
I'm not, for the record, upset that the Mandarin is not actually an Asian person, because that would have been bad.
It's worse.
But there we go. So so there are very few Asians, if any, in the MCU, and yet you have things like Hawkeye going to Japan to murder people.
He worked out his issues by murdering some Japanese people, but that's okay.
Yeah. Incidentally, that Japan looked basically exactly like Madripoor.
Oh my god! Maybe they just got mixed up and went to Japan, and all the information they got in this episode was false. Like they just got caught up in a whole other thing.
The set, they were like, oh, give us the Hawkeye murder scene. They were like, sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Great. Yay.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I have to say about Madripoor. But we wanted to talk some more about race in general in this show.
We sure did. Now, sort of what brought this to mind for me is that there was an article in Gizmodo from a writer called Charles Pulliam Moore, who I'm not familiar with like the full body of his work, but I did like his piece on, I believe it was Steven Universe. He's the guy that wrote, unless I'm getting mixed up, and I'll check before I put this episode out, but I believe he is the guy who put out the article arguing that Pink Diamond / Rose Quartz is the great villain of the 2010s, that she is the best written villain of the 2010s. And that, of course, is provocative because like, referring to Rose Quartz straightforwardly and simply as a villain is provocative for it. It's provocative for a fandom that's like waiting in the wings to be provoked at any little thing. But anyway, now
I haven't seen that. I'd like to.
You should check it out. But yes, as apprehensive as I am to contradict black critics who think that this show isn't up to snuff in its racial politics, I'm also apprehensive to dunk on a show about racism, about black-white relations in the United States, written by a black man, Malcolm Spellman, for not being anti-racist enough, although I'm feeling a little bit less apprehensive about it after this episode, all things considered.
Yeah.
So let's get nuance core.
God.
As my friend Audrey calls it. So look, we joked about this previously. You had a little joke about it in your verse of the Lemony Snicket song that you wrote for the last episode. But in light of S.H.I.E.L.D. being Hydra and Winter Soldier, and in light of everything in Civil the Fuck War, why does Sam place his trust in the military?
I have no idea. Okay, I mean, there is a... Alright, so we had this conversation via DM, I remember when we read this article.
Yes.
And what I was saying was that basically the writer of the article, who claims that there is something quite offensive about the idea that Sam, an American black guy, is not aware that racism exists, or is not aware of racism to the extent that you'd expect a person from his background to be. And yes. I said that I'd agree with that, but at the same time, like, I think... So I'm, again, like, neither American nor black, so I don't really have a perspective from that community on this, so, that said. But as a Chinese person, my community has a lot of investment in the concept of a model minority. And in Singapore, we are not the minority, which maybe is where that, for my, specifically the Singaporean Chinese community comes from, because we don't really, in our home life, have skin in the game in terms of racism. We're the majority in Singapore. We benefit a lot from racial privilege. That's its own thing. But as a Chinese person who's lived overseas and interacted with a lot of overseas Singaporean Chinese people, there is a lot of cultural weight behind the concept of being the good immigrant, of being the nice one. And even for people who this can range from the sort of, we are grateful to be here, we are grateful to have this space, let's not step on any toes. Why should immigrants have a say in the way that things are run? That's not even our country kind of thing, which, obviously. But, there's also the sort of more nuanced take of, yes, racism is real, but if we do X enough, we can get ourselves out of it. If we are smart enough, if we do well enough in school, if we're polite to people, if we are rich, maybe we can buy our way out of the system. This is also, if you watch Crazy Rich Asians, kind of the animating force behind, say, the first scene, where, a bunch of really rich Chinese people get their way and show up this really racist white hotel concierge in England because they get thrown out for being, bedraggled looking and also Asian, and then they buy the hotel and fire him. So that's the fantasy of having enough money to buy your way out of racism, or being good enough to get away from this stuff. Yeah.
If only we could be rich, that would be totally unproblematic. Then you could win society.
Yeah. Exactly. And I don't think it's that Sam... I mean, if we are mapping Sam onto this model minority kind of idea, I don't think it's that Sam doesn't recognize that racism exists, or that Sam isn't angry about racism and he doesn't see the way that it affects him and the people around him, because he clearly does. But I think it is possible to read Sam as a sort of person who has a level of trust towards a system that up to this point has rewarded him for being good within it. Because even though Sam has obviously faced discrimination in the past, and he acts like a person who has faced discrimination in the past, he's also the sort of person who, joins the military and does well, who's treated like a hero, who gets called up by Captain America, and even when he's on the run from the government, he's like righteous and famous and doing good work.
Yes. Can you, because I think this is an obvious point where someone could argue against this, can you give examples of how Sam acts like someone who has been discriminated against in the past?
I think that his response to Isaiah Bradley's story is probably the best example I can give. So that's mostly in episode 2, where he, like, his level of anger about the thing that has happened to Isaiah goes beyond a sense of genuine decency or even a sense of solidarity with this person and straight into, like, the territory of racial trauma. This is something that I've recognized in myself from living in Oxford and hearing about other people experiencing racism. You know, it's not about the event itself, it's about how it makes me feel like, well, and feel like the thing that is true, which is that the world hates me and that life is unfair, specifically against people like me and my people. That felt very powerful to me. And I can only imagine that it would feel differently for a person who has experienced similar, like, for a person in a community that's closer to that experience, specifically for Black people, or and rather than like visiting student in.
But there's things that are transferable.
I'd assume so. Yeah, I don't want to project too much onto Sam, but I did recognize that, and I thought that was really quite powerful.
Pretty heavy stuff.
Sorry, did you want to talk for a bit?
I mean, not with any great confidence on this topic, but I think one thing that people keep coming back to in the conversation about this, and that Pauline Moore talks about in his article, is that this show, he says, feels a bit like a Saturday morning special, in that, like, the MCU has gone through most of its run without talking about racism, and now it is the show for talking about racism. And, you know, the weak argument against this is that Black Panther exists, but that just means that we have another second Saturday morning special. I think it's more of a case of whether or not something feels like a Saturday morning special. It has a lot to do with what ideas it's putting out versus what you already know.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, I was on board with the first couple of episodes, but that is because, like, as much as I give it my best game shot, I don't ultimately know much about the experiences of a minority in that I'm not a part of in a country that I don't live in. Whereas if you are that, and also you're a pop culture writer who specializes in representations of race, and that's like your job to write about that, then maybe the new MCU show about that isn't gonna resonate with you.
Yeah.
And I don't think that makes you wrong, but I think that would make one come at it from a particular angle that perhaps the show isn't really aiming at.
You said that you'd be more inclined to question the racial politics of the show after this episode. Is there anything in particular that makes you feel that way? Aside from Madripoor, I guess.
No, Madripoor was the main thing. Like, that kind of, like, completely scuppers the idea that this show is straightforwardly doing racial politics good or even okay. You can't turn around and say, oh, well, that bit was bad, but it gets the race politics about the United States so good, because, like, all these things intersect. And, like, I think that just shows a certain degree of thoughtlessness about important aspects of it. And I was quite disappointed by that, because I think it had been going pretty decent up to this point. There are parts of it that I really enjoyed. I felt that there was... I keep using the word specificity, but I do think that there's a specificity to, like, a lot of the beats in the first couple of episodes, and even, like, in the moments of this third episode that worked. Like the joke from Zemo about the Trouble Man soundtrack, where Zemo said, No, it's a masterpiece. It captures the African American experience. And Sam's like,
Sam was like, wait.
He's out of line, but he's right.
Yeah. I was going to mention that, actually. I don't know how I feel about Zemo being woke. I mean, obviously he's not, but also, like, this is not the only time he says this. I wrote this down. There's a bit where Sam goes, "Does this make me look like a pimp?" And then Zemo says, and I quote, "Only an American would assume that a well-dressed black man looks like a pimp." He says this to Sam.
He says that to Sam, yeah, and I don't know how I feel about that.
I'm less racist than you are, Sam. Like,
yeah, fuck you. But I suppose Sam has not exactly proven himself to be an especially conscientious person over the course of this show, but all the same, it's a weird moment. It's interesting because, like, for all I rag on Civil War, and for all that I wasn't really sold on Zemo in that movie, the reason I wasn't sold on Zemo in that movie isn't anything to do with Daniel Bruhl, who did a good job. It was because, like, the themes were underbaked, because, like, everything about plot and character was trying to do something or other, but it was ultimately shoved to one side in the service of getting one half of the Avengers to run at the other half of the Avengers. And, you know, I've gone over this before. So when the teams when they only kind of run a torch over them rather than cook them through, the result is that when you have a bad guy who's there to, like, kind of be right about things and kind of have a point to make, that doesn't really work when the themes aren't really cooked through. Whereas this, you know, I think we're past the point of me straightforwardly saying show good, but you know, it's more considered than Civil War, like many things are. And so, like, when Zemo turns around and he talks about how Bucky still has a little bit of the Winter Soldier in him, even if the mind control has been taken out, that rings true. When he talks about how Sam has built Steve into a symbol now that he's grieving Steve, that rings true. So I think he's landing a bit better. Also, when he has a big coat and a mask and he shoots people, that's very cool, and that works too.
It is. Actually, yeah. So, aside from that weird, like, schooling Sam on racial politics thing, Zemo's really interesting in this episode. We should probably talk about him some more.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, thank you for pointing out that Zemo's whole thing as a villain is that he's right about everything. Because I hadn't actually made that connection. You're absolutely right, and I hadn't made that connection. And I was like, what is he doing this episode? This is so interesting. But actually, it's a direct continuation of his role in Civil War, because he's right about everything in this one, too.
He is right about everything in this one, too. And, like, he brings in the stuff from Civil War in a way that feels like it kind of, like, deftly kind of cuts out the stuff from Civil War that annoyed me. He still talks about Sokovia. He even talks about the Red Skull a little bit, and about how, like, a cult of personality can lead to that. So it feels like it's connecting the whole thing into, like, one story in a way that, like, the Captain America stories feel like they do, in the little moments where things kind of, where the planets align and it manages to do deft little sleight of hand things to kind of make you forget that not all of it is actually very good. Yeah.
I think the thing about Zemo that is most unsettling and most effective is the fact that he understands people really well. He's, like, just a genius of psychology, and not even in the sort of evil, like, mad scientist kind of way. He's just, he's a better therapist than Bucky's therapist.
Oh, for sure. He's got that Hannibal Lecter thing going on.
Oh, man. You mentioned the thing about how Sam put Steve on a pedestal, and so does Bucky, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, how do you feel about that? And the stuff that he says about that?
I was saying this in the first episode, so I get to look very clever. Sam and Bucky are building up Steve in their heads into being this, like, big deal. That, like, Sam turns down the shield because he doesn't feel like he can fill Steve's shoes. And that would be one thing if Sam didn't know Steve, but Sam was, like, friends with Steve and hung out with him and worked with him. And that's, you know, an unusual thing to say about your coworker. But again,
Exactly.
Sam met Steve when Steve was already a celebrity, and that's something that like wasn't really unpacked in Winter Soldier or Civil War too much. It's present in Winter Soldier a bit in their dynamic. In Civil War, Sam is just Steve's black friend, frankly, but it's kind of here. It doesn't feel like a parasocial relationship at all.
No.
It's like Sam did know Steve, but he is building him into being the same as the Shield. Steve is a symbol in the way that this Shield is a symbol, almost. There's very little talking about the specifics of Steve here, and I think that's partly because the show doesn't want to dwell too much on the past, and it's like making you wish that Steve was here still.
Yeah.
But, it doesn't want to Martha it.
Yeah.
And Bucky is similar. Bucky is kind of like building Steve up in a sense of like, that like Steve's judgment is so like infallible, and that if it's not, then that's a real shock to his value system. But like that's consistent with what came before, and it's tricky because like this is what First Avenger unironically believes, that Steve is a basically perfect person, and when he does do things wrong, like make out with Emily Blunt or whoever, then the movie doesn't really give a shit about that, because who wouldn't, frankly?
Natalie Dormer. Oh.
So like Natalie Dormer, excuse me.
I think Sam is getting over the attachment between Steve and the Shield by the end of the episode, and I am thrilled and fascinated by Sam saying that he should have destroyed the Shield, because he should actually. Like, I agree with you, Sam, but I just never expected you would say it.
Same. Like as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, maybe they are going to do the thing that Kim says that
I'm
like,
a genius.
You are a genius. We're so good at this. Subscribe to the pod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that Bucky is not willing to do it, and he said, actually, Bucky, who has never before indicated a desire to be Captain America, implies that he would take it up just so that he could have it back.
I think this is what the show is leading toward, like a big fight between Sam and Bucky over who gets to be Cap. Well, not who gets to be Cap, but who gets the Shield, because they want to do directly contradictory things with the Shield.
Yeah, I get the feeling that Bucky doesn't particularly care who Captain America is. He kind of just wants to take the Shield home and crawl into it because his best friend is gone. I feel like, honestly, he probably challenged Walker to single combat so that he'd get the Shield back, and then he'd just take it home and, sleep with it as a bolster. Like a giant teddy bear. Like, use it as a dinner plate or something. Like...
Jeez.
No, but his whole thing, him being like, the Shield means a lot to a lot of people, especially, including or especially to me, which I think is sort of showing his hand a bit more than he expects to be. Because what he's not saying, like, he's saying the Shield means a lot to a lot of people, but what he means is, I just lost my best friend, and he was the only thing I had in this entire screwed up world, and you gave away the last thing that any of us had of him, and now I don't know what to do with myself.
But at the same time, that exists at the same time of the Shield being this symbol of the US government, essentially, and like patriotism, etc. Like, it is ultimately Captain America we're talking about here, which leads to the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is this show propaganda?
I mean, yeah, but like, let's just skip right over. Yeah, no. Carry on.
Oh, okay.
No, sorry, I was joking. Let's talk about this.
Okay. It all kind of comes back to that initial very bad 8-minute scene at the start of the show where Sam kills like 5 people in the service of the United States Air Force, as there's a bit that in retrospect, is funnier than I gave it credit for when the US Air Force said, "Oh, we can't invade Libyan airspace." And I think I was just, like, pleasantly surprised at... I expected it to be worse, so I was just relieved at the time. But it's not actually good, and I understand why it immediately turns a lot of people off, and I think a lot of people of political persuasions close to our own just kind of, like, switched out from the show at that point. From that point onward, it has been more interested in challenging institution and challenging power, and that sort of Winter Soldier zone of it's still being, like, slightly deferential to certain paradigms in the way that you might expect the Disney products to be, but it's still doing valuable work in the sense that, like, it's showing that passing the shields to another not quite a random white guy, but to another white guy in this context would be, like, heinous. And it's showing the supposed bad guy, Carly, to be a very, very sympathetic person. And it's only at the end of this episode that we see Carly doing something straightforwardly bad that is framed as bad when she blows up a building. And that's only dropped in at the point where, like, you can actually see where she's coming from. So
yeah, this is the first bad thing she has done on screen. And also her friend's reaction to it implies that this is the first bad thing she's done off screen as well. Because her friend's like, Carly, what the fuck? And she's like, well, you know, this is the only language these people understand. Which is sympathetic, even if I would never advocate blowing up people for any reason. But
as someone from Ireland, I find that, like, that tends to not work out. Tidy.
I agree that it is a bad thing to do, but I think it is important to note that the fact that her friend was horrified by this and she had to explain herself kind of heavily implies that she has never done this before. And that basically everything that we've seen her do is the sort of thing the Flag Smashers have been doing, which is stealing from wealthy hoarders, bringing food and vaccines to refugee camps, and fighting off evil government agents. It's like... Yeah,
and, like, the line immediately before that was, like, Carly saying to whoever she has tied up, like, you had 6 months of supplies just sitting there in that building. So I was like, hell yeah, get him! And then she blew up the entire building when there were people still in it, and I was like, wait, no!
No, don't get them like that!
Yeah, speech at them, like epic Aaron Sorkin.
Okay, no, but don't. You know, I know at the beginning of the segment I said, yes, of course, this is propaganda, we can move on. But actually, I feel as if this is significantly less propaganda than I would have expected. And in fact, I am kind of leaning towards, like, this is secretly anti-military propaganda. But I would hesitate to make that like, assertion before we get to the end.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, okay, no, but the idea that Sharon has now been banned from the States and is living the life of a stolen art dealer in Madripoor. I don't know how I feel about that in general, but the idea that she, like, Madame CIA, is like, it's all hypocrisy, the state sucks.
Yeah.
Heroism is bullshit. This is all stupid. I've wasted my life, like, being an agent of a state that cut me off immediately for just doing one thing, and then I've wasted the rest of my life hiding from them.
From the point of view of the MCU, it's not even the thing that was bad. Like, she sided with Captain Mapton.
And also notably, like, everyone else who did that is fine now. They all got taken back in because they are superheroes, and she's not a superhero, and so she, unlike Sam Wilson and freaking Bucky, does not get amnesty. Yeah, and I think it is, like, really, really interesting to see the woman who embodied the institution suffering at the hands of the institution because she is no longer a valuable asset, and turning around and being like, this was all bullshit. And I mean, this may be undercut slightly by the fact that she is angling for a pardon to get back to the States, but I think that this is sort of at least partly, like, quite obviously a thing where she just wants to be back with her family again, because she, like, made a whole thing about that.
Yes.
And also possibly just a ruse because she's got something else going on with some other person that we see a glimpse of, and I'm just very confused by this entire thing. But hey, Sharon Carter says fuck the CIA, so...
I suppose she does. So, this is not perhaps the most interesting angle in keeping with the general tone of the podcast, but I had much more issues with Sharon's deal in this episode on a sort of script doctor editor level of, like, her popping up halfway through and being like, hi, as you will remember, I'm Sharon Fry, who previously appeared in the 2016 film Civil War in a very small role. Anyway, I'm here now. It doesn't really make sense that I'm here because, like, it's actually a very big world, so it doesn't really make sense that I would just pop up. Anyway, let's go back to my flat. As you can see, I'm f***ing loaded for some reason. And so on and so forth. And then, like, she's just another person who's here to be right about everything. And while I am ultimately, I do have a soft spot for, like, cool secondary lady characters coming back, and they've taken a level in badassness. They have a gun and a leather jacket, and they're violent to people. Like, that's catnip to me. But I do want a little bit more, and I think that, like, she doesn't feel like she's totally got her own completely distinct viewpoint on the world that's separate from Zemo's. Because Zemo, which might seem like a crazy thing to say, but Zemo's deal in this episode is to be, like, someone who doesn't really like Bucky and Sam, but is working with Bucky and Sam, and frequently needles them in ways that the show clearly thinks is right. Yeah. And Sharon is also that. And, like, they come from very different backgrounds and have had very different roles in the narrative up to this point, so they should feel more distinct, and they kind of don't.
In fact, I think they should feel even more distinct, because my vibe on Zemo and Bucky and Sam is that Zemo likes Bucky and Sam a lot. It's just that his version of liking people...
Yeah. He should definitely dislike Sam more on account of Sam being an Avenger.
No, I think that his version of liking people is very similar to most people's version of disliking people.
Oh, wow.
I think Zemo likes Bucky and Sam a lot in the same way that I really like Civil War.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, the way that I really like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I get to take it apart and talk about it constantly, about how much I dislike various bits of it and think it's stupid.
Yeah. God, yeah, it's like me and this fucking Chip and Leora Doctor Who.
I was gonna say.
Just like that, but with people. That's sane. Here's another thing we can take apart.
Yes.
Is it homophobic?
Is it? Hang on, no, wait. Before we move on from that for a second.
Oh, excuse me.
No, it's okay. I'm just wondering also, in the vein of imperialist, militaristic propaganda, or not, how do you feel about the opening sequence of this episode, which we skipped right past? Oh,
yes.
You know...
like when they bust Zemo out?
No. The bit before that, where the new Cap and his best friend storm a civilian, what looks like a computer cafe, looking for the Flag Smashers, and, like, throw their weight around, and one guy goes, "You Americans have become brutes." To which Cap,
brutes.
Follows up with a bit of nice police brutality, and then yells, "Do you know who I am?"
Yeah.
Yeah, we know who you are. You're Captain America.
Yeah, literally, when that happened, I did a little fucking Robbie Williams micro voice, like, "I'm Captain America."
Who's strong and brave here to save the American
way. You know, when I saw that scene rolling up and they were about to bust down the door, I was half expecting it to just be like a little old lady with her cup of tea or something.
Yeah. This, like, not to go on for that long, I'm just saying, like, as we've said multiple times, this show is very, very critical of various things that other parts of the MCU have taken for granted. And one of those things is costume good guys storming into civilian locations and shaking people around and shouting, "Don't you know who I am? I'm Captain America."
Yes, it's a big departure from like the bit in Iron Man 3 where like Rhodey rolls up to what appears to be a sweatshop or something, and he's like, "Oh yeah, you're free, if you weren't already." Which
for the matter, all the times that Tony just like breaches various people's civil rights, and is like, "Fuck yeah, I'm Iron Man," which like okay. So I just wanted to throw that in there before we moved on. Do you want to talk about queerbaiting?
Homophobia.
Do you get much of that in this episode?
I think it's worth acknowledging that like this show is kind of like doing the Sherlock thing of coming at it as it's making jokes.
Yeah.
About like what if Sam and Bucky were a bit gay, but it doesn't seem like it wants to go there.
I don't agree with that. I can see where that's coming from, and I can also see where the queerbaiting argument is coming from. Obviously, my very glib answer to is the show queerbaiting is, well, it can try, but the MCU for sure cannot pull that off anymore. But the actual answer I have is that I don't think that the show... I mean, obviously the show is about the relationship between Sam and Bucky, but as the name of this podcast implies, it is heavily mediated through the missing third person in their relationship.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't think that the show is ready to go to a level of emotional intimacy between Sam and Bucky at all anyway. I mean, aside from the fact that the MCU is obviously very homophobic for obvious corporate reasons, but like I think the show has a very good character reason for like giving Sam and Bucky a certain degree of intimacy, but also a certain degree of like very carefully not intimacy, because the fact of the matter is that they are not friends. They are two people who loved one person very, very much, and that person has abandoned them in an uncomfortable new world where they both don't belong for various reasons. And I think like you this episode's not very heavy on that, but you do get this the really funny bit, like you mentioned earlier, about Marvin Gaye, where like Zemo's like, everyone loves Marvin Gaye, and Sam's like, yeah, everyone loves Marvin Gaye, and Bucky very defensively goes, I like Marvin Gaye, and Sam goes, Steve loved Marvin Gaye.
Steve adores Marvin Gaye.
Yeah, no, because like Sam's
Why aren't you Steve?
That's Steve's notebook. I know it because I know Steve. Furthermore, I contributed to that notebook, and I showed him something that he really loved. And Bucky's like, I like Marvin Gaye, I know what you're talking about. Yes. And Sam's like, you're not Steve. Steve loved this guy, and I gave it to him, and you are not him. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I can see where you're going. It's...
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn.
I mean, America's widows, am I right? They're arguing about the inheritance. Who gets the estate?
Oh my goodness.
It's funny because Sam got Steve's shield, but Bucky got Steve's notebook. That's a much more intimate piece of property. Where did Bucky get Steve's notebook?
I suppose where would it go?
Sorry, I feel like I keep cutting you off. Do you have anything else you want to say about about queerbaiting?
I think queerbaiting is fake. Well, not quite. I think that there are very few cases where queerbaiting has been argued as a thing that the text is doing, that I have found convincing. Like, no one's fucking coming to this. Well, maybe a few people, but for the most part, no one's looking at this thinking, oh, well, maybe they are going to make them kiss, because we just know that that's not going to happen. So from that alone, it's not queerbaiting. And I feel like the argument that it is queerbaiting kind of arises from, like, a non-malicious tendency to look at a thing that looks a bit like another thing and try to, like, apply a pre-made, here's one I made at home earlier, kind of an answer to a slightly trickier question.
Do you mind if we chat a bit about, first of all, Bucky and trauma, and second of all, the idea of character mythology and sort of like, this is very hard to explain, but hopefully by the time we get done discussing this, it will make a certain degree of sense.
Can I just say, like, it's it's kind of a failure on my part that I didn't just like ask you to talk about this in the first episode. Rather, it's dumb of me to like wait until the end of the third episode to let you loose on this.
No,
your most interesting take.
I mean, thank you
Go
very
wild.
much. But this episode made me really think about and the dissertation I wrote about these characters.
Yes.
So, okay, we'll start from a place of, do you agree that this is the Civil War reunion tour episode? Because I got that vibe. It's not even a vibe, it's like text. It's like the band's back together.
Oh, yeah, Zio's here, Sharon's here. It's the Civil War reunion episode, so I hope you like Civil the War.
And we get a lot of, like, random nods to this, like, to Civil War and also to other parts of the Captain America trilogy, most notably Notebook, Zemo and his trigger words. We get the freaking "will you move your seat up" discourse, which, like, thanks.
Yeah, we got an awkward callback to that, where, like, Seb Stan did a worse delivery on the punchline this time.
I didn't... Why? Why would they do that? But...
Oh, well, like, I get why they just couldn't resist.
Yeah. But I'm really fascinated by how this episode doesn't just do callbacks to Civil War, but also uses it in a very fanfiction-y way. And I don't mean that in a derogatory manner, the way that a lot of people do. Obviously, people who have never read fanfiction before and therefore have no right to talk about media.
Wow.
I mean, okay, look, you don't have to like fanfiction to be a media critic, but I feel like if you're talking about the media in 2021 and you have never read a piece of fanfiction ever, you really, like, are not qualified.
It's
hottest
like
take.
not having watched Citizen Kane or whatever.
It's worse than not having watched Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane came out like 50, 60 years ago. Fanfiction is now. Anyway, no, okay, but the thing about fanfiction is the use of canon as mythology, not just as like a thing that you refer to or like make callbacks to, but as like a like putty that you can play with, like a raw material to make new stories. And it's different from just writing a continuation of the last story, because it's not just that you are like writing a sequel, but it's a form of textual play that sort of involves you sort of digging your hands into old stories and making new things out of them in a very self-conscious kind of way, which I think is what this episode was aiming for with the text of Civil War, which is just interesting to note. But the thing that really got me was also how it turns, like, this kind of textual play turns character backstory, or like turns character identity into sort of mythic things. So I'm using the Umberto Eco concept of a mythic figure as a figure that is, first of all, unchanging. So it's a story that repeats itself over and over again. It's not a living person. It's a story that is static and therefore can be applied onto various different people because the story doesn't change. And also the idea of a mythic figure as a person who's embodied in various pieces of iconography. So you can get this from like sort of saints in Christianity, where you have like Saint Sebastian, who is impaled by a bunch of arrows. And if you have a picture of a Twinkie looking guy holding an arrow, that's probably Saint Sebastian. The same way that if you...
Hawkeye.
Yeah. Or like if you have a person holding a shield that looks like Captain America's shield, that is probably Captain America. And you know, the way that the Winter Soldier is treated as this kind of mythic identity in this episode, as a being that is distinct from Bucky Barnes and a person, and it's not just like the thing where the Winter Soldier was a version of Bucky from his personal history, was a real person, was a real lived-in part of his actual identity and his actual life, but more the concept of the Winter Soldier as existing distinct from and yet part of Bucky, the same way that Captain America existed distinct from and yet part of Steve. Where those two identities feed into each other, but the mythic identity is static and doesn't change and can be adopted or like put on or taken off again by adopting certain mannerisms or adopting certain icons. That sentence had no object, and it should have. I'm
Whoopsie-doopsie.
sorry. The backstory to this is I wrote an entire dissertation about fanfiction and Bucky Barnes, and the third section was on mythology, which is where I'm getting the Echo
Hell
quote
yeah.
from, because I don't just read Umberto Eco for fun. I'm not that cool. But what I'm saying is the bit where Bucky cosplays as the Winter Soldier and stands there and like does the things and does them quite badly, actually, is really, really fascinating to me for that reason. Especially the bit in the bar where Zemo is fake ordering him around and he starts beating people up, and the freaking Winter Soldier soundtrack plays again.
Yes.
You know, it really got to me how like self-conscious the episode itself was about what it was doing. Like, you know, even on a meta level, like the soundtrack comes in, the theme comes in, because they're like, Bucky's being the Winter Soldier now.
Yes.
And how the Winter Soldier has transformed from this like mythic figure who is nonetheless an actual character to a costume that Bucky can wear is really amazing. As is the fact that he's actually quite bad at wearing it, because Seb Stan the Genius plays him completely differently in this bit than in other bits where he is the Winter Soldier.
He doesn't just like go back into the glassy mode because Bucky's pretending to be that. He comes off entirely different.
Yeah, he is still Bucky. He's just Bucky pretending to be not him. And like, we who know Bucky know that that's not what he looks like. And I think it is, I don't know whether it's because he didn't need to put on a too convincing act and therefore didn't want to for obvious reasons, or more interestingly, whether he is just not capable of being that person anymore, whether he wants to or not. He can no longer access that part of himself, which is great for him. I mean, like, congrats, but I just, like, that's cool.
And yet there's a sense that there's, like, aspects of it he can't entirely shake off.
Yeah.
Like, he's still essentially a kind of person who solves problems with violence.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
This also makes me wonder to what extent Bucky's, first of all, fixation on Steve as a model for himself, and second of all, fixation on the shield and the Captain America identity as an icon of Steve, has to do with his own relationship with his identity and his past. Because, notably, Sam is a lot more detached from the shield than Bucky is. And I know you have pointed out in the past that this is really interesting because it would make more sense for Sam to associate Steve with the Cap identity than it would for Bucky, who knew him for longer, and who knew him, unlike Sam, before he became Captain America. And it makes me wonder if, because of his difficult relationship with his own mythic identity, wherein Bucky Barnes, like, he as Bucky is, like, Bucky Barnes is also a mythic figure that Bucky himself is having a very hard time embodying now that he wants to be that person. And whether his relationship with both the myth of Bucky Barnes and the myth of the Winter Soldier is informing the way that he thinks about Steve's relationship with the myth of Captain America in a way that Steve himself might not even have considered that relationship. Like, Steve has his own way of thinking about who he is. And Bucky is, I think, projecting a lot of his own feelings about who he wishes he could be onto who he thinks Steve was. I think it's something between him feeling both trapped and, like, attached to the various myths that he's associated with, and therefore projecting that onto Steve. And at the same time, I think that, like you said, he doesn't want to be the Winter Soldier, and he's trying his best to get away from that and, like, not doing a very good job. And he may or may not want to be Bucky Barnes, but he's having a difficult time with that too. And it might be that he's looking for another myth to sort of attach himself to. And that myth is the myth of Captain America, who is the thing that, like, who, you know, he's never liked Cap. He's always liked Steve. But now that Steve is gone, what he's left with is the story. And it makes sense that he, of all people, would be more attached to that story than most people would be.
Yeah.
So that was my dissertation.
Well, sorry. Now, well, if I'm not cutting you off, I think we will move toward wrapping up, because we've been going on a while.
Yes. Have you got anything else to say?
This episode was pretty racist, and I'm disappointed in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, not really, except that I am also interested in how sort of, this episode is obviously veering hard into comic book territory, and I think that's at the heart of everything that we've disliked about this episode, from its weird Orientalism, to its sort of, like, the way that, for me, it felt a lot glossier than the first two episodes in a quite off-putting way. I compared this, I can't remember if we were recording yet, but, like, this is quite similar to me to episode 4 of WandaVision, where it just sort of gives up the ghost and decides to be part of the MCU again. I think this episode's a lot better at doing that than WandaVision episode 4 was, and it hasn't put me off the show entirely. I thought it was still a pretty decent episode of television. But I think this episode, like episode 4 of WandaVision, quite neatly sums up why we cannot keep doing this. And why slamming all of the properties back into house style and into continuity references just flattens everything out and, like, tends towards racism at the same time in quite an uncomfortable way. But also, and, like, I'm just gonna say this without elaborating because it's gone on for too long, but, like, I think it's very interesting how, whereas Bucky fits very comfortably into this tone and style and into the plot of an episode like this, Sam does not. Sam is very bad at existing in this kind of universe, whereas he was very good, or at least comfortable, existing in the universe of the first two episodes. I think it's very obvious that Sam doesn't belong in this episode, whether it's the fact that in Madripoor he has to pretend to be a completely different person and then just flat out fails at it, to the fact that he's been on the back foot this entire time, whereas Bucky and Zemo are driving the plot. Sam is just like, what is happening? What is going on? Why am I here? Why are you doing this? And that feels like a conscious choice, and I like that very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just end the episode now. Sorry.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. All of that was very interesting, of course. We're just, like, mega out of time.
Yes.
Okay. You can find me on Twitter at Loafers Writes. Loafers is in the shoe, writes is in the verb. You can find my writing at marklaherty.wordpress.com. That's MARKLAHEORTY.wordpress.com. I'm on Patreon at Loafers, where you can hear my other podcast, Reading Player One, where I read Ready Player One with my lesbian married Canadian friends, Jesse and Sam. The theme song is by me. The art is by Carousel Unique.
Woo! All right. You can find me on Twitter at Kimberly_Chu. I am on Patreon at patreon.com/ChuKan, where I will be posting my dissertation if you'd like to read it.
Oh, will you?
Yes, I will. I've decided that's going to be my first ever Patreon post, my dissertation that I wrote in 2019. And
that's such a good Patreon post. You gotta go. You can donate to the Patreon.
And I am on SoundCloud, where you can find all my music at soundcloud.com/ChuKan. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, also, if you'd like to check out the 16 existing episodes of my sadly on hiatus podcast, Scribe to Screen, that is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So knock yourselves out. I hope you enjoy that one too, if you like the sound of my voice.
Yeah. Fuck yeah, sure I do. If you have a friend, I'm gonna do like the fucking engagement shit, so bear with me. If you have a friend who you think would like this, send it to them. And if you're listening on YouTube, like the video and leave a comment, like even if it's just a smiley face, because that shit does actually help with the algorithm. Or don't. You can just not do any of that shit. I'm not your mom.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. I want to suck Bucky's dick!
You can't do that every episode!
Do you have a better idea?
No, but that's not the point!